You're watching the Rails 3 screencast. I'm Greg Pollock, and in this episode, we'll be taking a look at active relation and active model. Active relation is a library created by Nick Callan, and it basically replaces the internal ad hoc query generation with query generation based on relational algebra. In Rails 2, if we wanted to get all of the posts that are published, we might run a query that looks like this. This is going to immediately query the database and return for us an array of post objects. In Rails 3, using active relation, we have a new syntax for generating queries. We simply do post.where publish true. The where method isn't going to immediately query the database. Rather, it's going to return an active record relation. Let's take a closer look at what active relation allows us to do. One thing we can do, because we haven't queried for the data yet, is we can add additional conditions to the query. So here we're checking to see if the order parameter exists, then add the order onto the post active relation. Then when we go to loop over all the different posts, it's only then that the query runs, once we start treating the active relation like an enumerable. Another way to describe what it's doing is, of course, lazy loading. As I was programming this code, I realized I could refactor it slightly. Instead of actually having the conditional to check if the order parameter exists, I can simply do post.order params order, and if the order parameter doesn't exist, it's simply not going to add that condition onto the query. What this means, of course, is that I could write this entire query in a single line, like so. Another side effect of active relation is I can reuse this object or maybe even split it. So here you can see we're specifying the order, and then I'm creating two different active relation objects from a single one. One is published and one is not published. Now, as I was coding up this screencast, I realized that this sort of looks like a bad example. If this was code in a real Rails app, we'd probably refactor this to use a scope or a named scope so that we could write post.published or post.unpublished. To specify the functionality in Rails 2, we would use the keyword named scope and then name it and send in conditions. In Rails 3, our syntax is changed in two ways. The first way is that we're using these methods to specify the conditions for our queries. The second way it's changed is now we're using the scope keyword instead of named scope. Named scope has been deprecated, so you want to make sure to change all of them to just scope. Now here's a list of all the new Finder methods which you can now use in Rails 3. Now the Rails 2 syntax is still going to work most of the time, so if you're upgrading an application, you don't have to worry about rewriting all of your queries to use this syntax. Lastly, I want to show you one more example of going from the old syntax to the new syntax. So here's a common Rails 2 query, and to write that in Rails 3, it might look something like this. If you read over these two different queries, in my opinion, the Rails 3 one is a little more readable. The other big difference between these two, don't forget, is that the top one returns an array, whereas the Rails 3 one returns an active relation object. So if I wanted these two to be more equivalent, I could add .all to the end of the Rails 3 query, which would force it to do a query against the database and return an array. Next up, we're going to be talking about active model, which has two core components. First is the active model API, which we won't be talking about, but basically it simplifies the interface for alternative data stores to be able to plug into Rails. The second core component is the active model helper modules, which we'll get into in just a minute. One thing you may have already realized with Active Record is that it contains a lot of great helper methods that you may want to use outside of a database. This is where active model comes in. In the active model helper modules, they have identified certain components you may want to use without a database, without active record, and maybe a plain old Ruby object. Some examples of the functionality these can give you are your callbacks. So when you want a before create, before save, you can implement just the callback module to get that functionality. If you want to do dirty attributes and figure out what attributes on your object have been changed, you can do that with that component. There's also serialization. If you want your object to be able to export to JSON or XML, you can do that with the serialization module. And of course, the most useful, validations. So you can have a plain old object that has validations just like you would in your normal active record models. So let's take a look at how we might use one of these modules in a Ruby class. So here we have a class called applicant. We're including active model validations. We can use validates presence of name and email, and there's our two attributes. Now if we go into the console and start interfacing with this class, we can set the name. We can check to see if it's valid yet. It'll return false. We can view all the errors currently for this object. If we then set the email address and check to see if it's valid again, it's going to return true. A good example of where you might use this in your web application might be a contact form. So you're going to have people fill out information that you want to validate. So you might create a plain old Ruby object, include the validations, say, validates first name, last name, email address. And then once they submit the form, you simply take the data out of those attributes, put them into your email, and send them off without even touching the database. Here's another example of using the JSON module so we can serialize an object into JSON. So we include that helper, we have an attribute accessor, and we have to define an attributes method. Some of these modules require you to define certain methods, and in order to do JSON, we have to define attributes. So now if we go to the console and start using this, we can set name equal to Greg, and if we call to JSON, we get back a JSON format. For more information on Active Record and Active Model, your best resource is going to be checking out the Rails guides on the topic. Well, we've reached the end of this screencast. Thanks for watching.